national security at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he's a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. He's written 12 books, and his latest one, Monsoon on the Indian Ocean, is available here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Robert Kaplan.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It was worth it to get up at 2:30 in the morning. Well, let me see if it's worth it, you know? Let me start this way. We've all been prisoners of two things. We've been prisoners of the Mercator Projection and of Cold War area studies. The Mercator Projection is the map we've all grown up with. It's the flat rectangular map that has North America and South America in the center, and the Pacific and Indian Oceans are consigned to the edges of the map and are broken up in half, and therefore are consigned to the edges of consciousness. Even though that most of the world increasingly lives on what is at the edges of this Mercator map. You have 1.3 billion people in China. You have 1.2 billion people in the Indian subcontinent. And squeezed between them, you have 563 million people in Southeast Asia. So you have almost half the world in the Indo-Pacific, between Pakistan and China, say. The other thing we've been prisoners of is Cold War area studies. Cold War area studies happened this way. The United States emerged victorious in World War II. It was a great power. It was the global hegemon. In fact, it was a unipolar world for 4 years after World War II until the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb. And in order to manage this world, the United States needed experts. And the only way to develop expertise was to divide up the world. So we had the Middle East, we had South Asia, we had Central Asia, we had Southeast Asia, we had East Asia, and so it went. But in fact, increasingly, what I'm here to tell you tonight is that this world is merging. All of these areas are merging together as one organic fluid continuum. And it's all happening at the edges of our Mercator Projection map. So that what we need is a new map in order to understand the world of the 21st century. And that new map would include the whole navigable southern and eastern rimland of Eurasia, from the Horn of Africa to the Sea of Japan. This is the greater Indian Ocean, which stretches from the Arabian Sea to the South China Sea, and including them both. And what is it about? What is the most important central thing about this map so far in our discussion? It's that the Indian Ocean is the only ocean in the world that has monsoon winds, that has a monsoonal wind system. Now, when Americans hear the word monsoon, they tend to think of a storm or a catastrophe or something like that, like a hurricane. But in fact, that's not really what a monsoon is. It's a weather system. It's a weather pattern. And what distinguishes the monsoon winds is that they're utterly predictable. They flow from northeast to southwest for 6 months a year, and then like clockwork reverse themselves from southwest to northeast for another 6 months a year. Because the monsoon winds, much more than the wind systems in the other oceans, are utterly predictable. It makes sailing distances calculable in advance. So that if any of you are sailors, it's hard enough to know what the winds are going to be like tomorrow or next week, or whether it's going to be a nice sailing day on Saturday. But imagine being able to predict the winds for 6 months out. or for a year out, or for 20 years out, to know exactly when to sail, not over 10 or 20 miles, but over thousands of miles. And thus it was the monsoon winds that united the entire Indian Ocean from the eastern coast of Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. It allowed the peoples of the Indian Ocean to be united thousands of years before the age of steamships. The other oceans required steamships to unite them. The Indian Ocean had the monsoon winds. It's because of the monsoon winds that the greater Indian Ocean became a very small and intimate space, even though it stretches for 4,000 or 5,000 miles. It's because of the monsoon winds that you find large Yemeni communities from southwest Arabia in Indonesia, 5,000 miles away, in East Asia, in the South Seas. It's because of the monsoon winds that you find large Malaysian communities from the South Seas, from the Far East, living in Madagascar, off the coast of East Africa, 4,000 miles away. It's because of the monsoon winds that you find Gujaratis from northwest India living everywhere around the ocean, particularly in East Africa, with large merchant communities. It's because of the monsoon winds that Omanis from southeast Arabia established colonies throughout East Africa. In other words, because of the monsoon, everyone was everywhere around this ocean, which encompassed about a third of the world. And why do I bring this up? Because it established a fluid, organic continuum that erased area studies. It erased the divisions of Cold War area studies, and it's the world we're going back to now. Because of the monsoon winds, you had Arabs and Persians building mosques in China, off the coast of China in the 7th and 8th century, 1,000 years before steamships. It's why you had Chinese navigators from the early Ming Dynasty in the 15th century making the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. It wasn't just the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and the British and the Germans and others who were in the Indian Ocean and the South and the Far East. It was also the Chinese all the way to the east coast of Africa in late medieval, early modern times because of the monsoon. It culturally united the ocean. And remember that we think of Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese navigator in the late 15th century discovering India. He didn't discover India. What Vasco did, the Romans and the Greeks sailed as far as Calcutta and Burma, before the Common Era, because they knew the wind system and how to use it. What Vasco da Gama did was he learned from the medieval Arabs off the coast of what is today Kenya and Tanzania the secrets of the monsoon winds that enabled him to sail from what is today Kenya several thousand miles to the west coast of India in 23 days in 1497. Now think of that, any of you that are sailors, what that's like. It was an incredible achievement. The Indian Ocean is unique not only because of the monsoon, it's also because of it encapsulates the entire arc of Islam, from the Sahara Desert to the Indonesian archipelago. Americans tend to think of Islam as a desert religion, spread quickly and ferociously by the sword in the early 7th century, all across North Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to Morocco and to southern Spain. But Islam is also a great seafaring faith that spread slowly and gradually, not by soldiers with swords, but by very sophisticated cosmopolitan merchants who sailed from the Middle East to what is today Malaysia, southwestern Burma, the Indonesian archipelago, the southern Philippines, the Sulu archipelago, and other places. And therefore it became a faith of the highly educated that was very flexible, very malleable. Whereas Islam dominated an entire culture in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, in India eastward to the confines of China, Islam, was layered on top of indigenous Javanese and Malaysian cultures, so that it became part of this very rich, exotic cultural melange. It was associated with open-mindedness. It's one of the reasons why Indonesia today, the largest Islamic state in the world, has also been a very stable democracy for the past 12 years. It's why you have democracy in Malaysia, another Islamic state. It's why, India, with 154 million Muslims, the third largest Muslim society in the world, is also a democracy. Looking at the map of the Indian Ocean allows one to see Islam differently. And that's another reason why it's so important. We're going back to a classical supra-region. If you've noticed, I've lumped together the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. Why do I do that? Well, right now, what connects the two oceans are the Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, and Makassar Straits, mainly in Indonesia. But in the future, we're going to have more connecting points. Earlier, the Gama's voyage heralded the beginning of 500 years of Western dominance in the Indian Ocean and the Southwest Pacific. The Portuguese built colonies throughout the ocean and the Pacific. The Portuguese were followed by the Dutch. The Dutch were followed by the British, and to a lesser extent the French. And they, of course, were followed at the end of World War II by the United States, particularly in the case of the United States Navy, which dominated the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific like its own private lake in the decades after World War II, right up until recently. But the world is changing. India and China are building great navies. The countries of Southeast Asia have increased their defense budgets by 33% over the last decade. Japan has 4 times as many warships as the British Royal Navy. We're seeing, the biggest story that is not in the headlines is the growth of Asian militaries, particularly Asian navies and air forces. In other words, we know that economic power has moved to Asia, but what we haven't learned from the media is that military power is moving to Asia, while we remain fixated on the Middle East. And one reason that I'm talking about navies and seas and monsoon winds so much is because even in this jet and information age, 90% of all commercial goods between continents come by sea. And then you have the undersea cables that connect us through internet and, and all of that. The seas are going to be more important than they've ever been because globalization depends on open and safe sea lines of communication. Who allows for globalization, for the clothes we wear made in Vietnam and China and other places? Who allows for elite conferences in Davos and other places? The United States Navy. Because without the United States Navy, these sea lines of communications would not be safe and goods would not be able to travel the world as if an afterthought. And so that's why it's important to focus on this. Over the next 20 years or so, global energy demand is going to increase by 45%, and half of that is going to come from demand from India and China. China's crude oil demand is going to double, and most of that is going to come from the Middle East, across the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca and the other straits, and north up through the middle-class flesh pots of Asia, to the coastal China, South Korea, and Japan. This is what's happening in the world today. And this is leading to, as we see this is leading to a crisis. And here it is. China, as I said earlier, needs other ways to get oil and natural gas to China, from the Middle East and Central Asia. So what's going on? All right, Western dominance is receding. The United States Navy peaked at 600 warships in the 1980s under Reagan. It was down to 350 warships under President Clinton. We now have, at the latest count, 286 warships. And given our economy, given the tremendous cost of sea platforms, the latest aircraft carrier is $12 billion. The latest Zumwalt-class destroyer is $4 billion. An F-22 is over $200 million for one of them. One new F-35 is going to be over $100 million. It's keeping the size of our Navy and Air Force at the same rate is going to become harder and harder to do. Meanwhile, China's economy is chugging along at 10% growth rates every year for the last 30 years. China's going to put more submarines to sea than we have within the next 15 years or so. They won't be as good. They'll be diesel-electric. They won't be nuclear. But they'll be quieter than our subs, and they'll be able to hide in the crowded waters off the coast of East Asia. And remember, we've just had 10 years of asymmetric ground warfare, where we've seen that, how a crude, low-tech, asymmetric enemy can humiliate us with roadside bombs and suicide bombs. Get ready for an age of asymmetric, high-tech sea warfare. I don't mean warfare in the sense we're going to war with China. I mean China's ability to deny us access to the South China Sea and other areas. Now, when you think of these growing coasts south of Mumbai, one ratchets up the other. If you talk in Indian policy circles today, you find there's increasing respect for an old British viceroy of 100 years ago, Lord George Nathaniel Curzon. And Curzon was the viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, the height of British power. And why is Curzon so respected by Indian nationalists today? After all, he was British. The reason is because Curzon had a strategic vision of India. He said India is the center point of Eurasia. That he saw a greater India that encompassed what is today Pakistan, Burma, and Bangladesh and southern Nepal. And he saw it complete with shadow zones of influence that included the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, and the jungles of Burma, all the way up to the Gulf of Thailand. So, an Indian sphere of influence that stretched from Iran to Southeast Asia. And this is how Indian nationalists, Indian strategists think of the future. They need a future strategic policy to go along with India's immense economic growth. It's, again, remember earlier in the talk, I talked about breaking down divisions. One of the most important relationships in the 21st century will be between India and Iran. Iran in the Middle East, India in South Asia, but one organic continuum. India needs Iran for its natural gas. India also needs Iran as a hedge against Pakistan. India is helping to build roads between Iran and Afghanistan so that Afghanistan can rely less on Pakistan and more on Iran. This serves India's national self-interest. Simply by growing as it does and increasing its involvement in Iran, and with Thailand, and with Burma, India becomes a great power to rival China.
Hello, my name is Paul Pass. I work for the World Affairs Council of Houston, which helped put on this event tonight. I thought his talk was absolutely amazing. We actually did a program even before with about 20 teachers in which he talked about the power of geography as it relates to China. He was able to expand upon that during his lecture and deal pretty much with the entire continent of Asia. I just thought it was amazing. He's an incredibly, he's an energetic speaker and one of the most intelligent people I've ever met.
I think it's interesting to see the Indian Ocean emerging once again in importance as a place for cultural interchange, as a place for commerce. But I think the question that seemed to hang over everyone's head tonight was, is it going to be a place for conflict or cooperation in the coming years and decades? And I tend to think that, as an optimist, that we're going to have more, I think, cooperation than conflict. I don't quite paint this picture of the Indian Ocean region as being a place for sort of that 19th century European Hobbesian kind of competition for resources and power and territory and that kind of competition. So I'm more, I think, leaning in a sort of constructive direction where oceans, sea lanes can bring people together, can, I think, promote commerce and I think trend more sort of in that sense of globalization that we're experiencing across other oceans and regions.